For 53 years, one man built a church from 50 members meeting in a small storefront into one of the most powerful black institutions in America. A 25,000-member congregation with its own cathedral, its own housing developments, and its own political influence that reached all the way to the White House. Then, almost overnight, he stepped down. No scandal. No forced exit. No public falling out. Just a father handing the keys to his son. But here's the question nobody outside the congregation really got a straight answer to. Who actually runs West Angeles Church of God in Christ today? Is it still Bishop Charles Blake Sr., the man who turned this church into an empire? Or is it his son, Charles Blake II, the heir who spent almost 20 years quietly preparing for this exact moment? And what happened to the other son, the one who was supposed to be second in command and then, just 2 years later, was gone? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one of the most influential churches in Los Angeles history changed hands, and why the way it happened tells you almost everything about how black megachurches pass down power in America today. To understand why this transition mattered so much, you have to understand what Bishop Charles Edward Blake Sr. actually built. In 1969, a young pastor in his 20s was asked by his own father, along with a senior bishop in the Church of God in Christ denomination, to take over a small congregation in Los Angeles. At the time, West Angeles Church of God in Christ had around 50 members. Blake was officially installed as senior pastor the following year in 1970. What happened over the next 5 decades is the kind of growth story that pastors study in seminary. Blake didn't just grow a congregation, he built an institution. Membership climbed from 50 people to more than 24,000. The church moved buildings multiple times to keep up with demand. In 1981, it opened a new sanctuary on Crenshaw Boulevard with a 1,000-seat auditorium. By 1999, that wasn't nearly big enough anymore, so the church dedicated a new cathedral just down the street, this one seating 5,000 people. But West Angeles was never just about Sunday service attendance. Under Blake's leadership, the church became one of the largest developers of affordable housing in South Los Angeles, and it built out more than 80 community outreach programs over the course of his tenure. Everything from counseling centers to mental health support groups to job training initiatives. This wasn't a church that just preached to the Crenshaw district. It was rebuilding it, block by block. And Blake himself became one of the most nationally recognized black religious leaders in the country. In 1982, Ebony magazine named him one of the 15 greatest preachers in America. Starting in 2007, Ebony began recognizing him nearly every year as one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the country. Beyond his role at West Angeles, Blake rose to become the presiding bishop of the entire Church of God in Christ denomination, one of the largest Pentecostal denominations in the country, with millions of members. He held that national position until his retirement from it in March of 2021, when Bishop J. Drew Sherd Sr. took over as presiding bishop of COGIC nationally. So by the early 2020s, you had a man in his 80s who had spent 50-plus years turning a 50-person storefront church into a cathedral with celebrity congregants, national political relationships, and a real estate portfolio. The question every megachurch eventually has to answer was staring West Angeles right in the face. What happens when the founder can no longer lead? Now here's where it gets interesting, because the way West Angeles handled succession is very different from how a lot of churches handle it, and very different from how a lot of scandalous megachurch succession stories go. The kind you've probably seen in documentaries about other ministries falling apart after a founder dies or steps down with no plan in place. West Angeles did the opposite. They planned for years. Charles Blake II, Bishop Blake's son, didn't just show up one day as an appointed successor. He was born and raised inside the church his father built. He went on to earn his undergraduate degree at Oral Roberts University, and then followed almost exactly in his father's footsteps academically by earning a Master of Divinity from the Interdenominational Theological Center, the same seminary his father had attended decades earlier. But more importantly, before he ever got the title of pastor, Charles Blake II spent close to 2 decades working inside the administrative and executive structure of West Angeles itself. He wasn't parachuted in. He worked as assistant pastor and as director of community relations, learning the actual machinery of how a 25,000-member institution with dozens of outreach programs functions day to day. The budgets, the staff, the building projects, the politics. In November of 2021, Bishop Blake made the succession plan public in a formal way. He announced that his son, Elder Charles Blake II, would be elevated to co-pastor of West Angeles. In the announcement, Bishop Blake specifically credited his son's near 2 decades of experience in senior executive and administrative roles at the church, describing him as someone whose intellect and business sense were matched by his commitment to ministry. The appointment, according to the church, was described as the product of collaboration between Bishop Blake, the regional jurisdictional bishop overseeing Southern California COGIC congregations, and West Angeles' own board of directors. That last detail matters. This wasn't simply a father unilaterally naming his favorite child as heir. It went through a formal structure, a bishop, a board, and the broader denominational hierarchy all had to sign off. So for about a year, Charles Blake II served alongside his father as co-pastor, essentially a trial run, a transition period where the congregation could get used to seeing him in a leadership role before the actual handoff of full authority took place. Then, in April of 2022, Bishop Blake stood in front of his congregation and made it official. He wasn't just naming a co-pastor anymore, he was stepping back. He announced his transition into what's been described as a semi-retired role, formally passing primary leadership responsibility to his son. This wasn't framed as an abrupt exit. Bishop Blake made clear he wasn't leaving the church or ministry altogether. He was stepping back from the day-to-day senior pastor role while remaining connected to the institution he'd spent his entire adult life building. And it's worth pausing here to note the timing. This announcement came about a year after Blake had already stepped down from his national role as presiding bishop of the entire Church of God in Christ denomination in March 2021. So within about 13 months, Bishop Charles Blake had walked away from the 2 biggest leadership positions of his career. First, the national denomination, then his own home congregation. That's not the profile of someone being pushed out. That's the profile of a man executing a deliberate, staged retirement. By this point, the writing was on the wall for what was coming next, a formal installation. On Sunday, October 23, 2022, West Angeles Church of God in Christ held what was described as a 2-part installation ceremony. It wasn't just a quiet changing of a name on a church bulletin. It was structured as a full weekend of honor and celebration, first recognizing the 53 years of ministry that Bishop Blake Sr. and his wife, First Lady May Blake, had given the church, and then formally installing their son and his wife as the new spiritual leaders of the congregation. Elder Charles Blake II and his wife, First Lady Deandra Blake, were installed as senior pastor and First Lady of a congregation that, by that point, had grown to more than 25,000 members. The scale of the event reflected just how significant West Angeles is within Black religious and cultural life in Los Angeles. The installation drew a guest list that read like a who's who of West Coast Black excellence. NBA legend Irvin Magic Johnson and his wife Cookie Johnson, actor Courtney B. Vance, Bishop Kenneth C. Ulmer, and others connected to the congregation over the decades. At the ceremony, Bishop Blake Sr. spoke about what it meant to hand over an institution he'd spent his entire adult life building. He described his 53 years as senior pastor as the deepest honor and greatest joy of his life, and made clear that even though he and Lady May were stepping down from their leadership positions, they weren't stepping away from the church itself. He said they intended to remain active members of West Angeles and of the broader COGIC denomination, and that they would continue to serve in an advisory role wherever needed. That's an important detail because it tells you what kind of transition this actually was. Bishop Blake wasn't disappearing. He was stepping out of the operational chair while staying present as a mentor and advisor, which frankly is exactly the model a lot of leadership experts recommend for founder transitions, whether you're talking about a church, a company, or a family business. The founder stays close enough to offer wisdom, but far enough away that the successor can actually lead without being second-guessed in real time. For his part, the new senior pastor spoke about what it meant to step into the role after years of preparation. Charles Blake II talked about the years he'd spent learning from his father, studying at universities and in seminary, and training specifically for this ministry. He described feeling honored and humbled to carry his father's blessing and guidance into this new chapter as senior pastor of West Angeles. Cookie Johnson, addressing the new pastor directly at the ceremony, reflected on the church's history with her family, recalling how, back in 1991, when Magic Johnson first publicly disclosed his HIV diagnosis, Bishop Blake and Lady May had stood by their family and offered them comfort during one of the most difficult and public moments of their lives. She told the new pastor that just as she had followed his father, she and her family would now follow him. That single moment captures something important about what West Angeles actually is. It's not just a building people show up to on Sundays. For a lot of prominent Black Angelenos, it's been a spiritual anchor through some of the hardest and most public moments of their lives. HIV diagnoses, career struggles, grief, celebration. And that emotional infrastructure doesn't automatically transfer just because a new name goes on the door. It has to be earned, generation after generation. By the time the installation weekend ended, the succession was complete on paper. But titles are one thing. Actually running a 25,000-member institution is another. Here's where the story gets more complicated, and where a lot of coverage at the time didn't tell the whole picture. Bishop Blake Sr. and Lady May had 3 children together. Charles Blake Jr., who goes by Charles Blake II or Elder Blake II in church materials, along with Lawrence Larry Blake, and a daughter, Kimberly Blake. When the October 2022 installation happened, it wasn't just Charles Blake II who received a new title. His brother, Lawrence Blake, was simultaneously appointed as assistant pastor of West Angeles. So on paper, this looked like a full 2-brother leadership structure moving into the future together. Charles as senior pastor, Lawrence as his second in command, both sons of Bishop Blake carrying the institution forward as a unit. For about 2 years, that's exactly how it worked. But in August of 2024, Reverend Lawrence Blake stepped down from his role as assistant pastor at West Angeles. He didn't leave ministry altogether. Instead, he moved into a new role as senior pastor of Palm Lane Church of God in Christ, a different congregation. In other words, rather than staying in a supporting role under his older brother indefinitely, Lawrence Blake moved into his own senior leadership position at a separate church, where he could be the top authority himself rather than second in command. Now, the church has not put out extensive public detail explaining the internal reasoning behind that shift. And it's worth being careful here. We're not going to speculate about family dynamics or tension that hasn't been publicly confirmed. What we do know, based on the public record, is the sequence of events. Appointed assistant pastor in October 2022, departed that role in August 2024, and moved into his own senior pastor position at a different congregation. If you know anything about how family succession works, in churches, in businesses, in any multi-generational institution, this kind of move is actually pretty common and doesn't necessarily indicate conflict. Sometimes it's simply that there's only room for one senior leader at the top of an institution, and a capable second son eventually wants and is ready for his own pulpit rather than permanently serving under his brother. Being asked to lead your own congregation of thousands of people is not exactly a demotion. It's its own major responsibility. What it does tell us, though, is that the succession plan at West Angeles wasn't fully locked in the moment the October 2022 installation happened. It kept evolving over the following 2 years, just like leadership structures do in any large living institution. So let's answer the question directly. As of today, who is actually in charge at West Angeles Church of God in Christ? The senior pastor, the person holding primary spiritual and operational authority over the congregation, is Elder Charles Blake II, leading alongside his wife, First Lady Deandra Blake. He has held that role since being formally installed in October 2022, and public church materials, including the church's own website, continue to identify him as the senior pastor leading West Angeles today. Bishop Charles Blake Sr. has remained connected to the church, consistent with what he said at his own installation ceremony, that he wasn't stepping away from West Angeles, just stepping back from its day-to-day senior leadership. He's continued to be recognized for his decades of national influence within the COGIC denomination, even after handing over both his national and local leadership roles. Meanwhile, the church itself has continued operating at full scale. It's hosted business and vision meetings under Pastor Charles Blake II's leadership, walking the congregation through the church's direction, its programs, and its finances as an institution moving into a new chapter. West Angeles continues to run the kind of community-facing programming that defined it under Bishop Blake Sr. Prayer services multiple times a week, Bible study, mental health and family support groups, senior fellowship programs, and community outreach events, all continuing at its Crenshaw District campus. So to put it plainly, this wasn't a hostile takeover, a scandal-driven exit, or a fight over control. It was a slow, multi-year, formally structured succession, co-pastor role first, then full installation, with sign-off from a bishop and a church board, followed by an ongoing family involvement even after the handoff. The only real plot twist in the story is that the succession plan didn't stay static. The assistant pastor role shifted hands within a couple of years as Lawrence Blake moved on to lead his own congregation. Here's why this story is worth understanding even if you've never set foot in Los Angeles or attended a COGIC service in your life. Megachurch succession is one of the most fragile moments in American religious life. We've all seen the other version of this story play out publicly. A founding pastor dies or steps down suddenly with no real plan in place, and the church implodes into lawsuits, splinter congregations, and public infighting over money, property, and authority. It's happened at ministries far bigger and far more chaotic than this one. West Angeles avoided almost all of that, and the reason comes down to a few deliberate choices. A multi-year runway rather than an overnight announcement. A successor who spent nearly 2 decades learning the actual operations of the institution rather than simply inheriting a title. Formal sign-off from denominational and board authority rather than a purely personal handoff. And a founder who stayed connected as an advisor instead of disappearing or clinging to control. That's a case study, not just for churches, but for any family-run institution trying to figure out how to survive the transition from its founding generation to the next one. Bishop Charles Blake Sr. spent 53 years turning 50 people into 25,000. The real test of that legacy was never going to be what he built. It was going to be whether it could survive him stepping back. So far, under his son's leadership, it has. So that's the real story behind who took over West Angeles Church of God in Christ. A deliberate, years-long succession from Bishop Charles E. Blake Sr. to his son, Elder Charles Blake II, with a mid-course shift when Lawrence Blake stepped away from the assistant pastor role to lead his own congregation. If you found this breakdown helpful, let me know in the comments what other church or ministry succession stories you want covered next. Because trust me, this is far from the only one worth digging into. Make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more where this came from.